Good evening, you lucky anti-statists and anti-authoritarians. This is Matthew Struck with Why Libertarian. You get a double feature this evening. That's right, we were live earlier at 5 o'clock Eastern, and now we are live again here at 6:30. We have a fantastic follow-up to this evening's first episode. I am joined by none other than Curt from Checkmate the State. How's it going, Curt?
Going really well. How are you, Matthew?
Awesome. I'm very good, very good. It's almost Christmas. My kids are going to get to open some presents and have some fun. So I think that's going to be a good diversion from kind of the muck that we've had to deal with for the last 9 months or so. Wouldn't you say?
Yeah, no, my kids are definitely looking forward to it too. So should be a good weekend.
Yes, most definitely, most definitely. So I want to thank you for coming on. Anyone who's unfamiliar with you, you predominantly have a presence on Twitter, right? As your main platform of communication. Are you also anywhere else, or is that pretty much your mainstay?
Yeah, Twitter is definitely my mainstay. I'm also recently opened a Substack account, which I think is what kind of sparked this conversation. but yeah, Twitter is definitely the best place to find me. Checkmate State.
Checkmate State, and then the Substack is, I think it's checkmatestate.substack.com. Is that right?
That's correct. Yes.
Awesome. All right. So so the blog in question that we're talking about, and you write have you always been have you always done a lot of writing on kind of like libertarian topics and issues, or is this kind of a recent thing for you?
This is a recent thing for me. I mean, I haven't been a libertarian for a super long time anyway. I've been on Twitter for about 1.5 years, and then just within the last few weeks started writing long form stuff. So yeah, it's definitely a new avenue for me.
Awesome. So I don't really want to dig too far into, kind of like how you came to libertarianism. I mean, maybe we can kind of uncover that in like future episodes. I really kind of want to get to like the meat and potatoes here. And the one blog article that you referenced, I'm just going to share on the screen here, was a blog entitled Guerrilla Politics. And I think, so you authored this basically in the twilight of this year's election?
Yes, exactly. So essentially after the election, I noticed a lot of people that were disappointed with the results that Joe Jorgensen and Spike Cohen got. And my thought was they did exactly what they needed to do, right? The whole point that I thought the libertarians were running for was to, change the outcome of the election, to spoil the election. And they did reach the point where they had where they'd gotten more votes than the span between Biden and Trump in those key states in Pennsylvania and Georgia and Wisconsin and Michigan and Arizona. And so I was like, they did it. I was celebrating, and a lot of people were a little surprised by that. They were disappointed by the results. They were hoping they would get a little bit of a higher number of votes, a higher percentage. And so I just wrote it to kind of explain my thoughts for why spoiling the election is actually a victory for libertarians, and why that should be our focus instead of maximizing votes, and what we can do with that power once we establish ourselves as a spoiler in the two-party system.
Right. Well, so in your kind of like a Reader Digest version, I definitely want people to go check out the blog and also sign up and throw their email in so that they can get future writings that you put out there. But so, from your point of view, what is the real power of being the spoiler? I mean, most people who are like consider themselves an R or a D, the spoiler is like the annoying fly that they have to shoo away. But from your standpoint, it's a pretty powerful position to be in, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, it is annoying when you're a spoiler, and that is where the power comes from. So I think, one thing that libertarians are very well aware of is that democracy is not as responsive to the will of the voters as a lot of people think, right? This is something that is a talking point that we discuss all the time. But then when we talk about our own election strategy, we don't really take that into account. We're just saying, hey, we're going to get the most votes possible, and then naturally the policies that we want are going to follow from that, right? Once we get enough libertarians elected, once we get a libertarian president elected, then we'll, obviously as an extension of that, we'll naturally get the policies that we want. And really, I mean, one key libertarian insight that we just haven't applied to our own election strategy is that the way policy comes about is from someone getting leverage, right? So it might be somebody, the one example that we give all the time is, corn subsidies, right? These farmers, it's not that they have a huge amount of votes. It's not like corn subsidies are a super popular policy. It's just that they have a leverage over the politicians, right? They have a lot of money. They're in key swing states. They're in Iowa, where the Iowa caucus is. So they have a lot of leverage over the politicians, and so they're going to get what they want. And so what my thought is libertarians, we need to use the LP not as a way to get a maximum number of votes, but as a way to get the maximum amount of leverage against politicians. And that means annoying them, right? But it also means, getting that power over them so that we can actually get policy. Because even if we get a president elected, which is a long shot, there isn't a guarantee that that's going to naturally lead to the policies that we want getting enacted, if that makes sense.
Right. Well, yeah. So it's kind of like it's like a chicken and egg argument, right? Like, so do the policies come first and then the elected officials, start to show up more so on the stage, or is it the other way around? And I kind of like the way that you frame it. It's really, the winning the political races shouldn't be the first stop. It's almost kind of like the end of the train, right? Like the beginning of the train, or the first stop where you get on, is, having your voice, developing that leverage, and then really kind of leaning into it almost, such that, like, when you are proven right. I mean, I just got off of a broadcast with Adam Kokesh and Shane Hazel, and we were talking about, I mean, Shane's like the ultimate spoiler right now, at least in terms of the current political pantheon. But, just talk about kind of like the idea of like cannabis criminalization, right? It wasn't necessarily the laws that changed first, or the politicians that changed. It was the people's culture, right? Like just the culture of people within the country. And then it was some of the laws started to change, or some of the kind of like community action started to change. And it wasn't until that point happened that then all of a sudden you started getting sympathetic politicians that would then kind of memorialize this change. Am I kind of characterizing that right?
Well, I mean, I think you are correct that culture needs to change. Let me take a step back. The way that most libertarian strategy goes, and this is what I'm pushing back against, is, hey, we need to first change the culture. We need to change people's minds about libertarianism and turn them into a libertarian. And then after we do that, then we'll win elections. And then after we do that, then we'll get the policy done. And I'm saying, let's skip the first two steps, right? I don't want to wait to get libertarian policies passed for the culture to change, right? That could take years. I want that to happen now, right? I don't want to wait for us to win an election. I want to say, with the resources that we have right now, what are some things that we can do to make meaningful policy changes in the libertarian direction without even waiting for the culture to change, right? So that's kind of where the difference is. I think of it, and I quote Milton Friedman on this in the article, but his point is, one point that he makes is that it doesn't really matter who you get into office if the incentives are wrong, right? If you get the right people in office and the incentives are wrong, they're either going to go ahead and follow the incentives and enact unlibertarian policies, or they're gonna, they're gonna lose, they're gonna get out of, or they're gonna lose their elections and lose power, or you're going to be in a situation where, on the converse side of things, if you have bad people in office, but the incentives are right, they're still going to enact libertarian policies. And so my thought process is, in a two-party system, a third party actually has the ability to act as that mechanism to force the wrong people that are already in office to act the right way, to make it politically profitable for them to enact the policies that we want right now.
I like that thought process. I would say it also creates some immediate action steps that are a little bit more empowering, I think, than some of the other kind of tacts that people are taking in the libertarian movement that require a lot of this, well, give us, 10 more years and eventually we'll get someone in office who's going to enact some stuff. And then everyone says, okay, well, if we only get one, how are they going to enact libertarian policies when, they just have one vote, right? I like that. I like that thought process. I think something that you also said was, like, if you are acting as a spoiler, you need to, like, embrace it and own it. Do you feel that Dr. Jorgensen and Spike kind of owned that spoiler, element here, or do you think that they didn't get necessarily enough mileage out of that?
No, so I know Dr. Jorgensen and Spike both got a good amount of criticism for some of the messaging that they had related to, like, Black Lives Matter and things like that. Those didn't actually annoy me very much. What annoyed me much more was when Joe would go on to a podcast or something along those lines and say something like, hey, if you're in a swing state, go ahead and vote for the two-party candidate, right? The Democrat or the Republican that you prefer. But if you're not in a swing state, it doesn't really matter. Vote for me, right?
Yeah.
That's
like the opposite.
Yeah, that is not embracing the spoiler status at all. In fact, I mean, in my article, I say we shouldn't even focus on non-swing states at all, right? As far as the two major candidates go, the only votes that really matter to them are the votes in the swing states, right? The votes in Pennsylvania, the votes in Georgia. That's why they spend all their time in those states. And the truth is, for a third party, those are the only votes that matter to us too, right? So we need to own that. And when someone gets annoyed at us, right, because that is going to happen. I live in a swing state personally, and I spent a lot of time trying to convince people to vote for Dr. Jorgensen. And some of them, said that their families were very annoyed at them when they were in Republican families because of their choice to vote libertarian. But, the answer to that situation is, hey, we're holding these parties to a higher standard than you are, right? They haven't done anything for us. And so they need to earn our vote. That's what we're doing when we vote for somebody else, is we're holding them accountable for that situation. And so, yeah, absolutely. Whenever you have the chance and you're talking to somebody in the other parties, make sure you own that fact that you're a spoiler. Don't ever try and convince them that we didn't actually spoil the election, right? Like that's the last thing you do. Like, I always hate this when I hear this from libertarians. Oh, if you actually look at exit polling and who voted for the libertarian candidate, it was people that wouldn't vote. Never do that, right?
Yeah.
If someone gets mad at the libertarians for spoiling the election, say, yes, we spoiled the election.
Yes.
And here's why we did it, right? And next time, if you want our vote, make sure you earn the vote.
Yes. Well, and not to mention the fact that you're also, to your point, you're gaining more leverage because you're going after the highest value voters, right? Like that couple million that you trim from disenfranchised, like, yes, we want them to vote for the campaign as well, but that couple million that you trim from deep blue and deep red states, it doesn't make the establishment parties hurt. They don't
Right.
care. Like, they'll just write those votes off. And not to mention the fact that when you have and presidential campaigns or presidential elections, even though, you know, electoral numbers can look like landslides, it's really a vast minority of voters that decide who ends up winning that presidential election, or say, you know, a Senate seat in a contested state or something like that. And so, to your point, I definitely see that. And you actually gain the ability to do more with less, which is what we have, right? Like, we don't have huge war chests. We don't have a monopoly on these entrenched, you know, financial financial kind of like conflicts of interest that exist
Right.
with establishment candidates and the establishment parties. So, you know, with less money, we can make even bigger waves that way. I think that is. Are you a reader of Sun Tzu and the Art of War at all?
I have actually never read Sun Tzu. The book
Okay.
that I read that made me realize how this strategy could work is actually it's a different book. It's called David and Goliath by
Mm,
Malcolm Gladwell. And
okay.
in the book, and I would encourage everybody to read it and think about, as you're reading it, like, hey, how does this apply to libertarians? But the book is entirely about underdogs that win, right? You know,
Hmm.
like David versus Goliath. Obviously, he tells stories about sports teams that have every disadvantage and end up winning. He talks about guerrilla tactics in war and how they can win. And that's the point that he makes is that when underdogs win, they almost always do it the same way. And the way that they do it is they refuse to fight their opponents on their terms, right? So
Right.
from a libertarian standpoint, if we say, hey, you know, we're going to fight the two parties on their terms, that means, you know, begging to be in the debates. That means going after, you know, ballot access in all 50 states. That
Right.
means, you know, getting 51% of the vote before we can get any of our policies enacted, right?
Yep.
Those are the kinds of things, those are the way that they want us to play, right? That's the way that they compete against each other. But if we compete against them that way, we are going to lose, right? And so the
Right.
insight that I drew from it is just, hey, we need to find a way that we can break those unofficial rules that the two parties, you know, kind of hold us to, right?
Hmm.
That doesn't mean we should break the official rules, right? We should make sure that we're not, you know, committing election fraud or anything like that,
Of
but
course.
break those unofficial rules and find a way to leverage that to get what we need done. And so that would be the book that I would actually recommend. Sun Tzu sounds great. You know, definitely read that and think about ways that libertarians can use the insights there. But David and Goliath has some really powerful insights that libertarians can use.
Yeah, no, I love that story. I love that story. We have a comment from someone who's watching on Twitter. Libertarians running for, say, the House or the Senate need to do what Republicans do when they run, and I think that's an important note here. I don't think anyone's saying that you don't run like a strong campaign, right? I think what you kind of distilled for me was the idea that you could run a really strong campaign and still have zero chance of winning. So why not
Yes.
go somewhere where even if you lose, you win, right?
Right.
And you can also, you know, focus a finite amount of resources within those really high value places. And if you think about it, so like the story of David Goliath, right? Like, anyone who's not familiar, hopefully you are, but if you aren't, it's essentially, you know, a smaller man beating a much larger, almost, you know, unbeatable foe by essentially using a very small rock and hitting them somewhere where they're vulnerable. Well, it doesn't get much smaller of a rock and more vulnerable than, you know, the 30 or 40,000 votes that swayed the election in, say, Wisconsin, right? Or
Right.
the, you know, 100,000 votes that swayed the election in Pennsylvania. Those are numbers we can get by conventional means, knocking doors, phone banking, like actually having the candidate out there meeting people in those really high value areas. I think that's transcendent, and that all came from this one book, or is this something you had been also kicking around for a while?
I mean, it definitely has been something that I've been kicking around for a while, for sure. But I do want to comment on that comment that was made from the Twitter viewer. I actually disagree with that comment a little bit,
Okay.
and the reason I disagree with it is because when you are running election to win the election, right, you're going to use different strategies than when you're going to spoil the election, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so,
Mm-hmm.
you know, I definitely would not consider the same strategies that past libertarian candidates have used in order to maximize their votes as being useful from the strategy of spoiling the election, right? So, for example, just as I mean, this is an obvious and simple one. There's no reason for a libertarian candidate to waste resources in Idaho, right?
Yeah, right.
As much as Idaho is a great state, you know, I don't want to be insulting to anybody there, but that is a different sort of strategy, right? That's a strategy that's focused on getting maximum number of votes. The strategy of spoiling the election is going to focus those resources in Pennsylvania instead, right? And so, you know, I actually object to the idea that we should be doing the same thing that the other parties are doing. If we do that, you know, it would be like David going and trying to fight Goliath, the giant with his armor, you know, with a sword himself and a spear, right? There's no chance that he's going to win. But if he can stay far away from Goliath and hit him in the head with a rock, you know, that's a situation where it's very plausible for him to win. So that would be the mindset shift that I would encourage people to have, is to shift away from thinking, how can I get the maximum number of votes, instead of thinking, how can I get the maximum number of leverage, or maximum amount of leverage,
or like the right votes, right? Like I think that's really key, right? So focusing in on, you know, if you're talking about, you know, campaign tactics, you know, the folks that you want to focus on are the undecideds. They're the ones that are in the middle, or also the ones that are disenfranchised, but within those key strategic districts or states where if you can plant the seed of libertarian, you know, libertarian philosophy or kind of those planks, those folks are then going to hold to task much more effectively the people that end up getting elected. And like you said, even if you get like a crappy candidate elected, if the people that basically control their fate, you have then kind of, you know, seeded with, you know, this thought process that is different than the standard kind of, you know, left-right paradigm or whatever. I think you win that way. I mean, that is definitely, you know, creating a game that is completely different than I think the game we've been trying to play all along, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, conventional wisdom in politics right now is that, you know, 9 times out of 10, 8 times out of 10, the incumbent is going to win, right? And if libertarians can change that calculus, right? If we can change them to thinking 9 or 8 times out of 10, the incumbent is going to lose unless they meet the demands of the Libertarian Party, you know, that is a very different scenario, right? And that's the scenario that I want to get to, is, right, you know, saying, hey, if you just govern the way that we want you to, we'll let you stay in office, right? But if not, we hold your fate in our hands, because we can get those, you know, 100,000 votes in Wisconsin, those 100,000 votes in Pennsylvania, pull those away from you. And if we do that, you know, we're not going to win the election, obviously, but you're going to lose, and that's all that matters to you, right? So that's really where that source of leverage comes from, is spoiling the election and holding them to account. And I will say this too, one point that you made, and again, this is someplace where I think we can shift our mindset a little bit. You were talking about how when we're in those key states, you know, we can convert people over to being a libertarian in those key, you know, areas where the votes really matter, that is a valuable thing to do. But we don't actually need to shift people over to being a full-blown libertarian for this to work either, right? For example, let's say in 2024, we're gonna be wanting to spoil the election for the Democrats, right? Because they're the incumbent party, right? We have a message that can work really well for their base to pull them away, and it doesn't necessarily need to be a message like, hey, you need to switch over to become a full-blown libertarian to vote for us, right? The message can be, hey, the Democrats, they talk a good game, right? They talk about the things that you care about reforming the police, about criminal justice reform, about ending the drug war, about bringing the troops home. These are things that you care about, and they don't do anything for you, right? And we're not asking you to become a full-blown libertarian. We're just saying, vote for us right now, because unless you withhold your vote from them, they're just gonna know that they can keep talking a good game and doing nothing for you, right? And so if we can get 50,000 people to just commit to vote for us for that one time, right? That's going to make a big difference in terms of their vote. So that mindset that we need to turn people into libertarians to have an impact, that we do need to have some people become libertarians, but I think we overrate the importance of that. We have enough libertarians right now to have a really huge impact.
Yeah. And I think if we do take that tact, that you will end up, like, it might not be necessarily it might not necessarily be your primary goal, right? But I definitely think it becomes likely that you will get people that will then begin to kind of see the other side of the coin, so to speak, or not even the other side of the coin, but see kind of where we're coming from. And I think you would see people that come over, but it would be, a multi-step process. Yeah, I definitely see that.
No, I think having wins really matters, right? So for example, let's say that we go to the Democrats and say, hey, we're going to spoil the election for you. We're going to run a candidate that is appealing to your base, and we're going to focus his or her energy in areas where you count on winning a very high percentage of the vote in order to win these states. And we're going to change the outcome of the election for you unless you enact these policies that we demand, right? And let's say that they listen, right? I'm skeptical that they'll listen right away. We might need to spoil a few more elections before they realize that how important it is to do what the libertarians are asking them in order to win. But let's say that they do by 2024. That's still a really positive thing for libertarians to embrace, right? We can go to these to people and say, hey, we are actually the people that got criminal justice reform enacted for you, right? We scared the Democrats into finally doing that after years and years of promising to do that. We're the ones that did that, and that's a powerful message to people. Just getting results for them, getting them the policies that they want. Yeah, I agree 100%. It can work in our favor to bring in more libertarians, but it doesn't need to, right? Definitely shift that mindset away from how to get more libertarians. Start thinking how to get what we want with the number of libertarians we have.
Yes. No, I love that. I love that. All right. Let me transition. So there was another article that you had put out that really caught my eye. And this was put out, let's see, a little less than a week ago. Yeah, maybe 4 or 5 days ago. And this isn't the article that deals with, it's called Defense of Archie Flower. This is an article that kind of goes through, there was a debate basically between Dave Smith and Archie Flower, right? And I didn't watch the actual debate, but I think Dave Smith kind of trounced Archie, right? Or at the very least, it was a Dave Smith victory, as is typical with these cases, right?
So yeah, I mean, I think the universal verdict was that Archie lost in a landslide. But my thought, as I was listening to the debate, was that he actually his argument was a lot more interesting than people gave him credit for. And to everybody's credit, Archie didn't explain it very well. And he admitted it. I've talked to Archie about it since then, and he was disappointed with how well he communicated it. But his message, his point, was actually a really, I would say, elegant and impactful point that I think is completely original to libertarianism. Right? We talk about racism sometimes, but nobody has made the point that Archie made before, and I think it really has a huge impact on the way that we should view the non-aggression principle and the way that we should view its relationship to racism.
So what is the embodiment of that argument that maybe Archie didn't do a fantastic job of enunciating? I think a lot of libertarians, when you start to talk about race and the non-aggression principle, immediately kind of the alarm bells go off or the red flags go up, and they say, okay, well, you're about to tell me something that is compulsory, and I don't like compulsory. Like, I want voluntary, I want, freedom to do what I want with my own property and things like that. And I don't need some alternative way of defining existence that then begins to kind of like contort away from my ability to be, autonomous and make my own decisions. So what was kind of the point that maybe didn't get made by Archie's argument that really kind of resonated with you?
So yeah, Archie's point, he was not saying that racism was a form of aggression. That was something that was very clear that he was trying to bring across in his discussion, but he was still saying that it violated the non-aggression principle, and that might sound a little bit strange, but he was using a different definition of violate than what most people think of when they think of violate, right? Like think of the Constitution. If you're violating the Constitution, most of the time what people think that it means is you're breaking the rules of the Constitution, right? The Congress has passed a law that is prohibited by the Constitution. But there are other ways that you could violate the Constitution, right? Like disrespecting it, twisting its meaning, things like that. And so what he was saying was that that racism doesn't violate the non-aggression principle in the sense that it's a form of aggression. What he's saying is that it violated the non-aggression principle in the sense that it violated it by corrupting it or by perverting it in a sense, right? And so his argument, the way that it's perverting the non-aggression principle, is it's subtly changing a definition of a word within the libertarian or within the non-aggression principle. So the non-aggression principle, what it says is that no person has the right to aggress against any person's or anyone's person or property, right? To initiate aggression against any person or property. And he says, one way that the non-aggression principle can be corrupted or perverted is to change definitions of words within the non-aggression principle, right? So, are you following this? Or
Yep.
Okay. And so he gives the example of property, right? If you change the definition of property, right, you completely change what the non-aggression principle means, right? If you say, hey, I own, in a moral sense, I own the factory because I work there, right? Now, all of a sudden, it's not a violation of the non-aggression principle for you to go ahead and seize the means of production, right? For you to go full socialist just by changing the definition of that word. And what I think is a really elegant point that he makes is that by changing the definition of person, you take the moral authority away from the non-aggression principle in the same way that you do when you change the definition of property. And so his concern is that racism changes the definition of person to a certain degree, which doesn't violate the non-aggression principle in the sense that you're aggressing against someone, but violates the non-aggression principle in the sense that you're distorting it or corrupting it or perverting it in a sense. Did you follow what I was saying there? Hopefully I made it a little clearer with that.
Yeah, I think you're basically drawing you're basically drawing a parallel between, what the actual kind of like physical wording of the non-aggression principle is, and then what I guess the spirit of it is, right? Or kind of the idea of, how could, like, essentially this is taking the argument from the other side and saying, okay, if I was someone who, for whatever inspiration I have or compulsion, if I did want to, mainstream and legitimize racism and make it as something that is not subject to the non-aggression principle, or something that is almost like I could contort the non-aggression principle in a way that almost makes it sound like it's okay. Like, a perfect example would be, if I decided to just say now that, based off of a person's, melanin content in their skin, they are no longer a person, they are property. Right. And then if you basically, I have the right to utilize my property any way I want. And if you stop me, or if you try and like free my property from me, you're basically aggressing against me, is in its nature a perversion of the spirit of the non-aggression principle. Am I kind of grasping that right?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that libertarians have struggled with a lot is the relationship with between our philosophy and racism. And before I listened to Archie's argument, my thought process was, obviously I reject racism. I find it really terrible, abhorrent, stupid. But my thought process was, it doesn't really have anything to do with libertarianism, right? Those are two separate things. And his point is, hey, libertarians, if we want our philosophy to remain, pure and to have moral authority, we really do have an obligation to protect the philosophy from racism, because there is a potential there that, even somewhat less severe forms of racism than full-on accepting the idea that that Black people are are property. Even less severe forms of racism than that do have the potential to erode, the personhood of marginalized races. And so I think that's just a really powerful point, that, hey, if we want to maintain that moral authority that we have, we do need to be protecting that definition of the word personhood by actively standing against racism, just like we would protect the definition of property, right? If somebody came to us and said, hey, I have property rights in this factory because I'm using it, we would feel an obligation to protect that definition of property. In order to protect the definition of the non-aggression principle, we should have that same compunction to protect the definition of personhood when someone is being, racist or spreading racist ideas. That I feel like maybe there's the same level of obligation there to do that. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't be racist in a libertarian society, right? That doesn't follow from his argument. Just like in a libertarian society, you could spout faulty definitions of property, right? That wouldn't be there wouldn't be laws against you sharing ideas that property rights, or that the definition of property is different than what the property rights that we accept as libertarians is. But it still is something that we need to protect against in order to maintain the purity of libertarianism.
Yeah, I would say, and I can understand why someone would hear that, and again, kind of like, take a pause and be like, okay, well, it's not our job necessarily to fight the battles for other folks. Like I can be a nice person and basically treat other people that I identify as people with personhood appropriately, and that should be enough, right? And they get worried that now all of a sudden this would slant in that Black Lives Matter kind of contortion, or some of these other kind of critical race theory applications of being anti-racist or fighting racism. But that's not what I get from kind of how you're distilling this argument. What I get from how you're distilling this argument is something that, say, like, a Jordan Peterson would be in line with. And it's the idea that you have to fight the battles, not necessarily like on behalf of a particular race or on behalf of all races. You have to fight the battle on the part of humanity and all persons to defend that definition, right? Like that definition of personhood, we need to say, look, that is the definition. And you can't, or not that you can't, but we are going to basically actively, embody that in our daily, lives. And if you want to be racist in the sense of, how you think and how you act, that's fine, but we're not going to allow you to kind of en masse redefine personhood. Does that kind of make sense in terms of the way I'm attacking that?
Yeah, I think that makes sense. It's it isn't one point that I do want to make, and I think this is a really important one, is that there are a lot of forms of racism that are disguised as anti-racism. Just like, just like there's a lot of forms of fascism that are disguised as anti-fascism. We definitely shouldn't fall into the trap of believing the names of whatever the advocates give them. And so we need to push back against racism because of that potential, which I think is a real one for us to kind of pervert the definition of personhood when we embrace a racist ideology. But we need to push against all of that, right? Whether it's coming out as a form of right-wing racism, racism against minorities, or whether it's a situation where it's more of a left-wing racism that's disguised as anti-racism. I think either one of those are just as incompatible with libertarianism as the other. So both forms are something that we need to be protecting against. Absolutely.
Yeah. And I think, and again, I don't think that necessarily flies in the face of traditional libertarianism, because a lot of people are going to jump to the conclusion of, whatever the most inflated, sensationalized idea of what that looks like is. I think on a very fundamental basis, the idea of the non-aggression principles that myself, you, anyone else who basically purports themselves to, support the NAP, they're essentially saying that I want to preserve that for myself, but also I want to make sure that it exists for the other folks that applies to too, because, if I'm supporting the NAP just for me, right, I want them to support the NAP for themselves too, right? But at the same time, I can't necessarily allow that definition to get contorted, because eventually the definition could get contorted against me one day, right? Like, absolutely. So we need to kind of like draw that line and be like, look, this is that word, right? Like, this is what it means to libertarians, and we're going to fight against, contortions of that. If it comes like, and there are obvious lines, like we could do thought experiments on this all day long, but there are obvious lines where kind of like defending that definition of personhood stops, right? Like it doesn't go all the way up to, making sure everyone has the same income and making sure everyone lives in, a 3-story house or whatever. It's just kind of like that baseline idea of this is personhood, all right? And we are going to make sure to defend that, because, one day I don't want myself to have my personhood essentially undermined as a foundation of the NAP. Absolutely. Yeah. So I'm just now I'm sorry for blanking, but I'm thinking of all of the different kind of like, scenarios that we could throw that under the microscope on and kind of like discuss how it kind of like plays out, But I appreciated your perspective in kind of bringing that to light, because I would imagine a number of people that might have come across that would have just kind of glanced over it and been like, well, Dave Smith trounced him and he won. And so that's basically, this is now a moot argument. which I don't think it necessarily ends there. I definitely have to go back and kind of look at the original argument as how it was made in the moment as well. But it really it made sense from the standpoint of like, look, at some point there has to be a baseline, definition of what things are in order to build those frameworks off of. And so this kind of speaks to that idea of creating that baseline definition or that foundation that the NAP is essentially, built off of or coexists with, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I went into it thinking that they were totally separate things, and I 100% agree with the consensus that Archie lost the debate. There's no doubt in my mind. But I think that the argument that he made, it got lost in the fact that he was losing the debate, right? Everybody focused on the fact that he was struggling to communicate his points, and that, the debate really revolved around whether racism was aggression, which it is not. Archie did not change my mind about that, and he doesn't believe that either. But it does. It does have a relationship to the NAP, and we need to make sure that it's something where we're, protecting that definition of the NAP in order to maintain the moral authority of the NAP, which I think is a really important goal.
Yeah. Well, I think, again, I think that the other, we could play this with any of those words, right? Like the word aggression, the word property, the nature of any of those things, we have to have a certain baseline consensus on, because as soon as you start messing around with it, that's when the problems begin to happen that we're kind of like having now, where all of a sudden anything becomes a logical conclusion when it is anything but logical.
Yeah, absolutely. And even, I would even say to a certain extent, the debate that we're having about reparations, that plays into things here too, where, people are changing the definitions of things, of aggression, saying, hey, you aggressed against me because your ancestors did something, or not even your ancestors necessarily, people that have the same skin color as you aggressed against people that have the same skin color of me. And that perversion of that word aggression, right, has corrupted the NAP, right? They can now use libertarian logic in a sense to justify stealing from some people to give to other people, right? So it can go both ways. It doesn't necessarily need to be just, right-wing racism where this becomes a problem. It can be either side of the argument. We need to be protecting that definition of personhood from either direction of attack.
Oh yeah, and that's the propagandist's tool, right? You don't necessarily attack the argument. You attack the underlying foundation of it, and then you use that weakness or kind of the doubt to then begin to shift things in, your preferred direction in terms of the definition or the narrative. And so I agree with you. I think there are certain elements of this, and it's always going to be difficult. You're always going to have people that would either actively look to pervert the meanings of those words to suit their own ends, or people that unknowingly are complicit in that, calling libertarians racist because we allow the free association of people, which also means that you get to freely not associate with people, and you get to draw the line any way that you want. Right. But you just can't hurt them. You can't take their things. You can't, basically, use that baseline understanding of the word aggress. You can't cross that line. Right. And we need to make certain that at the very least we're, embodying and being vocal about not just the non-aggression principle, but also the components that make that up, so that people understand that there is a baseline level of of definition and support for those various terms. But at the same time, it is not a blank check to then just go ahead and take a very open or contorted definition of those words to suit your mood. I mean, hell, like I mean, I'm not an inherently religious person, but the Nazis and the KKK use biblical passages essentially to validate some of their viewpoints, but they are not using a traditionally kind of like accepted by the group definition of certain types of passages. They are taking an extremely slanted and again, not a a very one-sided viewpoint or trying to meet an end, and that's the viewpoint that they're using those passages from. So I'm completely on board with this. I think when I first started to read it, quite honestly, I was thinking, oh no, we're sliding into that Joe Jorgensen, you must be actively anti-racist territory again. But the end, I would implore anyone who's watching this now or watches the recorded version, definitely go on Checkmate the State or I'm sorry, checkmatestate.substack.com and look for the Defense of Archie Flower article on there, because you might have the same reaction, that guttural kind of, oh no, we can't be telling people that they have to do things. And then by the end of it, I think you do a really good job of kind of explaining how, we do have to, at the very least, defend the meaning of those words, because that's the underpinning of basically most of the libertarian, viewpoint, which is very important. Yeah. All right, cool. Go ahead. I'll give you the last word.
I do think it is important that we are also clear that being racist isn't aggression either, right? That is another direction that someone could go to pervert the NAP, is to say that racism is aggression, which was not Archie's point. He went to pains to say the opposite, but that is another way that a propagandist could switch libertarian logic and use it against us just by changing that the meaning of that one word. So it's something that we need to be on guard for in a general sense, is making sure that the meaning of those words within the non-aggression principle remain pure.
Definitely. Well, Curt, I want to thank you. I appreciate it. I know you're probably a busy person, especially now leading up to the holiday and whatnot. Thank you very much. I'm really happy you were able to share this. And look, I would love to have you back on again sometime, and we can talk some more we could dig into this further too, because like I said, there's tons of hypothetical situations that we can throw this into the testing machine and see how it comes out the other end.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll keep publishing things on my Substack. So I have some interesting things planned already. So make sure you subscribe, and we'll have plenty to discuss, I'm sure, in the future based on that. So I appreciate you having me.
Awesome. Yep. No, look, the door's open. When you have some more of this stuff out here, I would love to have you back to talk about it. So, and then anyone, again, you watch this live or in the recorded version, like, comment, subscribe. I would love to hear from you on what you thought about this topic or future topics that you would like to see on Why Libertarian. And just a reminder, every single Tuesday we come at you at 5 p.m. Eastern on pretty much all of our outlets. And then you can also find us on Anchor and your favorite podcast. So without further ado, thank you very much, Curt. Have a good evening, and we'll come back at you next week.
All right. Thanks for having me.